peace and security, and she teaches in Edinburgh, both graduates and undergraduates, and she's a published writer on the topic and works closely with Carol Cohn on the gender and peace building work that she's been doing. So I'll ask Clare to kick us off, and we'll take it from there. Okay, thank you, Clare.
Thank you so much, Janet, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining us tonight at this WILP event on women, war and climate change. So as Janet said, I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh and also a member of WILP, and I'm delighted to offer some framing remarks on the topic. So what can a feminist lens bring to our understanding of war and to climate change? And perhaps more importantly, in what ways can feminism help us respond? So I'm going to introduce tonight 3 senses in which feminist lenses help us both understand and respond to war and climate breakdown. And then our other 2 speakers will elaborate on some of the themes. Yasmin focusing more on war and Niamh more on climate justice. So one thing that feminists might draw attention to is the way that both war and climate breakdown have gendered impacts, often disproportionately harming women. So to take climate breakdown first, women often bear the brunt of coping with climate-related shocks and stresses because of the roles assigned to them in most areas of the world, which include responsibility for food management, for water procurement, caring for family members. Feminist scholars of forced displacement note that women are often less mobile and less moneyed. So as such, they face particular challenges when their homes and their livelihoods come under threat from climate disruption. It can be harder, riskier to seek safety. Climate-related health crises can be more lethal for women because in many parts of the world, health facilities are more often unavailable or unaffordable for them. Likewise, women suffer in particular ways in wartime. Again, because of the caring roles assigned to them, women bear the brunt of the devastation that war wreaks on crops and food systems, water and energy supply, health systems, and so on. So enduring war is one thing, doing it whilst carrying out care labour is something else. And then, of course, conflict-related sexual violence, including rape in the home or in public, continues to be a feature of every war with devastating consequences. So both war and climate breakdown have profound gendered impacts, but there are risks in emphasising the disproportionate impact of war and climate breakdown on women. What about the many men that suffer? What about other marginalised groups? And do we risk reinforcing the idea of women as essentially vulnerable, as victims, in ways that limit what women can do and be? So in ways that prevent them from being taken seriously as actors, as leaders. Which brings us to the second thing that feminists might draw attention to. And that is the way that mainstream policy solutions to war and the climate crisis tend to neglect women's agency. So women are not equal participants in major decision-making on climate policies and don't have their work on the ground developing sustainable solutions adequately acknowledged. And we've seen some attention to this at repeated COPs at the Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC. We've seen affirmations of the need to ensure gender balance, but that's still not been reached. And when it comes to responding to war, women are still hugely underrepresented in peace processes, comprising only 13% of negotiators and only 4% of signatories and 3% of mediators. And this is despite 20 years of the UN's Women, Peace, Security agenda, which is entirely focused on increasing women's participation in peace building. And this exclusion has huge consequences. So, for example, women don't get their concerns, whether that be sexual violence in conflict, the need for healthcare, the need for women's land rights, they don't get their concerns addressed in the peace process. They don't get to more broadly shape peace and post-war development. So feminists campaign for women to be included in climate negotiations and peace building, for their expertise and their agency to be recognised. But of course, there are risks here too. A focus on inclusion and participation based on the difference that women will make can lead to a reinforcement of stereotypes and myths that are not always wholly helpful. So whether it's women as sustainability saviours or women as the best peace builders, there's a rhetorical valorization here of characteristics that are attributed to women, an idealization of how they will be able to clean up men's messes, despite their very limited access to social, economic, and political power. Because these attempts at inclusion don't often come with a major transfer of power and resources. So you've got this idealization of how women will be able to clean things up, while simultaneously leaving in place all of the forces that have been driving the problems in the first place. Because the forces that are driving climate breakdown and war are structural. And these structures or systems are intertwined. So extractivist capitalism, militarism, patriarchy, racism, colonialism. Which is why feminists also draw attention to a third thing, power structures. The need to challenge them and to challenge the dominant narratives that naturalize and legitimate them. So if we're to address climate change, we need to challenge extractivist capitalism. Our current variant of capitalism relies on the extraction of natural resources as if they were unlimited and externalizes the environmental costs of production, from pollution to the release of greenhouse gases. It is this that has driven us to the climate and biodiversity catastrophes that we currently face, as is increasingly recognized across the world. And if we're to address war, we need to challenge the structure of militarism. Collectively, governments around the world invest nearly $2 trillion every year on military spending. And this spending has increased in the coronavirus pandemic, whilst everything else almost has ceased. Arms manufacturers have been treated as essential services in many of the major weapons producing countries. So we have structured our societies for war rather than peace. And to challenge these dominant power structures, such as capitalism and militarism, which are of course intertwined, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. To challenge these structures, we need to challenge the dominant narratives that underpin them. And it's ideas about gender that function to underwrite both the thoroughly extractive, domination-oriented relation to people and planet that's at the heart of our climate crisis, and the aggression, domination, confrontation that underpin and drive militarism and war. So from ideas that it's man's right to have dominion over nature, the attachment of some male political leaders to fossil fuels, to the idea that it's manly to stand up and fight, to have the most powerful weaponry. Feminists draw attention to the way that the association of masculinity with certain ways of approaching the world, that it's that association that makes those ways appear natural, appear realistic, appear superior. And the association of masculinity with certain ways of approaching the world also shapes the kind of solutions that are being proposed and invested in. So take the proposed fixes that get them to climate change that get the most airplay and funding. Geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, carbon markets and offsetting and so on. They may pose great environmental risks themselves. They threaten to deepen existing inequalities both between and within nations. They simply don't offer and aren't based on the kinds of deep transformations in our approach to the planet we live on that the scale and urgency of the crises demand. But their association with masculinity, technology, mastery over nature has enabled them to seem like credible ways forward. Likewise, when it comes to resolving conflict, the preferred approach is often confrontation and aggression. We consistently overemphasize the utility of force and underestimate alternatives. For example, in 2017, military spending was 12 times what OECD DAC countries spent on aid. Imagine if those resources were channeled into peace and development. That they are not is in part to do with the power and profit to be gained from militaristic responses, but it's also in part to do with the association of confrontation with masculinity that has naturalized militaristic and confrontational responses, made them seem like the obvious, realistic, superior ways of dealing with rogue states. So what does all this mean for how we respond to war and how we respond to climate breakdown? It's important to draw attention to gendered impacts, of course. They are very real, and they can be a really useful mobilizing tool, convincing people around the world to care. But we need to be aware of the risks as we highlight these impacts and make sure we don't essentialize women as victims. It's also important to highlight women's agency, because women often do have solutions, and it's women's right to participate, so they should be included as a matter of justice. But we also need to be aware of the risks and to mitigate them. So don't let women be held up as ideal peace builders, as sustainability saviors, without simultaneously making sure they are resourced and empowered to work towards structural change. And finally, it's crucially important to focus on and challenge the dominant power structures and the narratives that make them seem natural and legitimate. We need to claim the mantle of realism for an economic system that's based not on the short-sighted, destructive ethic of limitless individualistic acquisition and corporate concentration of wealth, but is instead based on an ethics of care and provisioning for people and planet. And we need to claim the mantle of realism for a political system that's not based on mutual armament, but one that recognizes interdependence among people and among nations as the basis for mutual collaborative action.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire. That was a really interesting presentation and gives us a lot to think about and a lot to build on in our discussion. We're going to have the 3 presentations, as I said at the beginning, and we'll follow that up with a discussion. So I'm not suggesting that we will have time for very much in the way of commentary, but certainly questions to the panel and anything that you might want to make an input. It would be extremely useful if you put that either during the discussion or at the end into the chat with your name and an indication of whether you want to actually ask a question verbally or whether you just want to leave the matter in the chat. I'm very happy to introduce to you Yasmin next, and her work on her dissertation on the challenges faced by female activists and journalists and political leaders and other people and women dealing with the current civil war and the humanitarian crisis, the building up of the Arab Spring and everything that grew alongside of that, will give us a really concrete illustration of some of the topics that Claire has raised. So Yasmin, would you like to give us your presentation now, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction, Janet, and thank you, Claire, for sort of prefacing these issues. Super important. So I'm just going to go ahead, share my screen, make sure everyone can see that. Right, can everyone see that? Is that good? Perfect. So yes, just as Janet said, my name is Yasmin Luqman. I'm a British Yemeni activist, very interested in sort of helping to uplift the voices of Yemeni women who are tirelessly working to make Yemen a better place. So I'd like to sort of begin this part of the discussion with discussing militarism and how it affects women and girls, very broadly speaking, and then sort of introduce Yemen as a case study to illustrate these effects. So as I said, I chose to highlight Yemen because I myself am Yemeni. and also as an activist, mostly campaigning for an end to the arms trade, but as it comes with that, to have sort of a feminist analysis of this issue as well. And I think it's probably quite common knowledge, perhaps, that Yemen is one of the worst countries in the world for gender equality. And this has only really been worsened by the ongoing war and humanitarian crisis. So we firstly need to define and understand what militarism is, just to see how it has these gendered impacts. So broadly speaking, militarism is the idea that a state should have a strong military and war-making capabilities, and war and not peaceful dialogue is used as a solution to global challenges and crises. So this means that states promote the production of arms and defense systems, and therefore the income that comes from this production and investments over other societal challenges such as climate action, which is relevant for this discussion, a pandemic response, also very relevant in our lives right now, a strong healthcare system, poverty alleviation, and other big challenges relevant to every country. So war and militarism have gendered impacts on women, although, as Claire said, and I absolutely agree with her, they do have impacts on men and boys as well, so we cannot ignore that. But some of the sort of distinct and common ways women are affected by militarism and war, particularly in more modern warfare, include an increase in gender-based violence, a decrease in equal opportunities, an exclusion from the peace building and conflict resolution process. So just with the caveat that there's no one specific reason that girls and women experience these specific types of violence and exclusion, nor is it ubiquitous across the country's regions and cultures. So just wanted to use the political and humanitarian crisis in Yemen to demonstrate some examples of how war and militarism affect women and girls. So just to give a very, very brief introduction, Yemeni women navigate their roles in a very traditionally conservative society. And even prior to this current war, and there have been several wars going on over the last 50 years, endure high levels of gender inequality compared to Yemeni women and compared to Western women, such as factors like high levels of illiteracy, restrictions to freedom of movement, child and forced marriage, and lower levels of education. However, with war and the humanitarian crisis, these are just some of the ways directly and indirectly that women and girls are affected, especially in areas that are controlled by the Houthi rebel forces, where it's much, much more difficult to be able to speak out. So these are just some of the gender ways. And I wanted to sort of underline that some of these are more psychological, long-lasting effects. So it's not immediate effects or just physical effects, and they're not always related to the ongoing war. So as activists, we do need to take some considerations. I think most of us are either in Scotland or in sort of the West. So these are considerations we need to take when we're discussing particularly just women in different parts of the world, but definitely for this case. So we must avoid putting women into a binary. So we cannot consider women as educated versus illiterate, or empowered and outspoken versus oppressed and voiceless. And we also cannot think of ourselves as providing that voice exclusively. We need to help to uplift, and that means sort of standing out of the way sometimes. And this can help us to have a much more nuanced view and understand the situation as a whole. And furthermore, while there are many incredible Yemeni activists who do risk their lives to be able to speak out and just take to the streets and protest, and sort of as I found in my research as well, to be able to speak out via the media and during the Arab Spring, citizen journalism, so even posting on Twitter, and push for seats at the peacemaking table. There actually are indeed women who do use their power and privilege to silence others and to uphold the patriarchy and militarism. So we cannot simply talk about Yemeni women as a monolith, women as a monolith, even feminists as a monolith. So that's another important consideration. And again, as we are in the West, we need to avoid white saviorism, which is, I think I've sort of underlined, being just sort of saying we need to go and save these people because there are so many, especially Yemeni women, who are already using their voices, who already know what the situation is like and what the appropriate response is. So we have to really avoid that. And taking an intersectional feminist approach and critique is a good way to approach this. And finally, with Yemen in particular, and many other countries are like this, but as Clare noted, taking an intersectional approach involves using identity factors like class, gender, ethnicity, and something that's quite applicable to Yemen, tribal status, as well, is really, really important to consider. We cannot just view it as men versus women. And as I said at the beginning, boys and men do also experience violence and depression. So the next thing I'd like to consider, which sort of goes hand in hand with the women, peace and security agenda, which is a really important sort of context to this. I'd like to just sort of give a brief overview of what women's inclusion looks like in Yemen. So prior sort of to 2011, there was not much political leadership with women, and they were excluded from that sphere. However, in the National Dialogue Conference in 2013, after the Arab Spring, there's a 30% quota for women in leadership and at the negotiation table pushed, which is pretty incredible considering I think it's 34% of MPs currently are female and 23.7% of US Congress is female. And that's sort of, I think, some good factors to compare to. So that's something that Yemeni women pushed for because women's inclusion is important in lasting peace. And then more recently in the 2018 Stockholm Peace Talks, women participated in 3 groups. So the Women's Technical Advisory Group, the Political Advisory Group, and the Women's Pact for Peace and Security groups. These are supported by UN Women, but they allowed for Yemeni women to push for their voices to be heard. So I'd just like to leave you with this quote. I'm actually, oh my gosh, my video is sort of in the way of it. There we go. So it reads, women are truly those who know what needs to be done. While the government's been in exile, we have been documenting what's been happening on the ground. We brought food, water, and oxygen to the hospitals, brought bread to the hungry, advocated for detainees to be released. The youth and women working at the grassroots level simply need to be part of the solution for Yemen. So I think it really illustrates when the Yemeni de facto government was in utter shambles, the warring parties were terrorizing Yemeni civilians, and the world just stood by and ignored Yemen for years. Yemeni women were actually doing the work to keep Yemenis afloat and to hold those accountable for committing to or for contributing to violence and instability. So for lasting change, and this is not just in Yemen, and in particular in post-conflict places, women's voice and demands must be included for peace to be effective and inclusive. Thank you.
That was marvelous. It was marvelous to hear, Yasmin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I mean, I particularly respond to what you're saying about the special knowledge and that women bring to the table. And as Clare said earlier, this is not because this is a gendered characteristic. It's actually because that work is so undervalued that's why it doesn't get the attention that it deserves, and it is left to people who are oppressed to try and make that case. So I think you communicated that how the manifestation of that in Yemen very well and very clearly for us. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Our third speaker today is Niamh McNulty. And as I said earlier, she has a particular interest in building anti-oppressive group practices. And I think actually unpacking some of the nature of why certain peoples are oppressed and how we can work to change that is of fundamental importance in tackling all of these three so interconnected matters that we've taken as our theme for tonight. And she's a student studying sustainable development with politics and international relations, but she's also an activist with Climate Camp in Scotland. And so I'm very much looking forward to hearing Niamh speak next. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Cool. So thank you to both of you for your little presentations, and a lot of what I'll be saying covers a lot of the same ground, just about the climate and ecological crises. So I'll begin speaking about ecofeminism as a route to helping us understand and respond to the climate and ecological crises, and then I'll dig into some more personal reflections about what this means for climate action and what climate action I take as well, also that we can take together, of course. So Banjari offers this definition of feminism, which you can see here, which really sharply draws together the sort of common ground of all the different strands of ecofeminism. And it contends that the domination of women and of the environment is really central, is really important. And I think that's something that a feminist analysis can really bring to this conversation. It's just that deep connection that these aren't separate forms of violence in any way. So this will be a very brief overview of the different traditions within ecofeminism and what they teach us, because they do have different implications for how we might go about responding to the situation we have on our hands. Please forgive me for leaving things out, because I will, but hopefully you understand I'm not trying to be reductive in any sense. So firstly, we have spiritualist approaches, which many of you might be familiar with. This isn't the whole gist, but part of it is that they see women as closer to nature by virtue of our reproductive roles within society. So I personally see that people are nature, but this ecofeminism argues, or some people within that branch can argue, that women are more in tune with the natural world than men, or indeed other genders. In doing so, it reproduces the idea that women are only their female sex characteristics, which of course is a patriarchal idea, and has serious implications for women and femmes. Indeed, womanhood is more than a set of body parts or a series of harm collectively put onto us. It's a social construct that implies we abide by certain roles. I also think it's key to note that womanhood is not universal, and we might skip over this by mystifying ourselves as women, and indeed other women. So I say this particularly as a white woman in Scotland, of course. When we mystify people, for example, Indigenous women across the world, that recreates the conditions in which Indigenous knowledge can be extracted and stolen, because it removes humanity. So many therefore might argue, and I would agree, that this spiritual ecofeminism does not depart from the oppressive conditions that devalue women, and is not transformative. Also, I understand why many people take solace in it, because it venerates nature and women, and that's really important. However, I do want to place it in the context of what the historic, critical, and Marxist approaches teach us. So this thought interrogates why we see women as more natural than men, or having a special connection to nature. So we can follow the idea that woman equals nature, equals other, equals not human, versus men equal culture, equal human, at least to the Enlightenment period, where white European men were categorizing people for economic gain. So if women, African people, indigenous people, queer people, and workers, especially people for whom those identities intersect, are equal to nature, that means we are its, non-human, and objects available for exploitation. For women, this often means that our role as providers of reproductive and caring labor, which, like the earth, is life-giving, is seen as a resource which can be taken from. This is because in the imaginary, it is wild and savage, but economically, we provide the next generation of laborers and allow men to be engaged in productive labor. So people can't go work for 10 plus hours at the newest fossil fuel factory site if there's not somebody at home doing unpaid labor for them. So therefore, it's not the connection to nature that's unequal, but this material relationship to nature, which is unequal. And that's really important, I think. So women being positioned closer to nature in terms of job roles, therefore have a greater stake in it, an intimate knowledge of its comings and goings, because they're not insulated from it, say within like masculinized professions, like in the office. And in that way, it also places us, or many women, as more vulnerable to natural disasters by stripping us of land ownership. So lastly, there's ecogender, and this is a social scientific methodology compared to a spiritual or political view, so I'll just go over it very quickly. But basically, it makes clear that all forms of domination are connected. So while it is women and earth, it's also, you know, many other identities. So that has to intersect with like race, class, sexuality, and so on. That our experiences of oppression affect our relationship with the environment. So the environment, our ecology, is deeply embedded within these like social stratifications of people. And that renewing respect for reproductive and caregiving roles is important for how we respond to climate and ecological crises. But so is emancipating women from those roles where they have been forced, violent, harmful, and played into that environmental degradation. So a non-exhaustive list of examples to sort of ground all of that theory is this little list. So women often report higher levels of action, even though they have less or reported less knowledge. And that's according to numerous studies by Gifford and Nilsson. So I'm not saying, of course, that women inherently care more about the environment or inherently are like less clever or knowledgeable, but there are social factors like less access to education, being socialized to be caring and community oriented impact how we engage in the world. And you can see that many women make up sort of informal action. So a lot of activist spaces, as you can see, are filled with women, even if NGOs or government positions aren't. We can also map environmental degradation and violence against women physically onto the land and onto sites of environmental destruction. So for example, across Northern America and indeed across the world, where new pipelines or sites of fossil fuel extraction are put up, often white male settler workers will enact violence against the indigenous women there. So there's a very clear logic and link that follows from extracting the land to extracting women's humanity. Another example is that at the same time that British land was being enclosed, like in the 1600s and so on, to make land for profit rather than as a life source for community, this is also when women were being burnt at the stake. And in both of these examples, land is power. And if you want to dispossess people of power, you dispossess them of their ancestral knowledge and connection to the land that sustains their lives and their community. It also affects how we go about solution making. So an ecofeminist approach shows us how it kind of shows up these false solutions, for example, carbon capture storage or nuclear, as being short-sighted. They're very technocratic. They're very masculinized industries that are still stuck in expansion and extraction of earthly resources. And then in a different way, it shows how a lot of sustainability initiatives, why they're targeted at women. So a lot of sustainability initiatives in the global north will say like, oh, you wives at home, like change which bleach you use, or change like which composting bag you use. And because within like the collective imaginary, like women, home and nature, these are in like the same sphere. But actually it's not women who have created this mess. It's not women who have been in the positions of power to create those things. They're not like the executives of Exxon or Shell or Chevron. But I would caution against, of course, having a female executive of Shell wouldn't change anything. So ecofeminism doesn't contend that just having more female leaders will fix things. It says that like patriarchy and capitalism are systems which demand that we participate in actions which will always be ecologically destructive. So we have no choice about whether we participate in them. And no matter what level we're at, we need to keep spinning the wheel and spinning the wheel. But ecofeminism teaches us to reorient our values towards respecting the earth, respecting women, respecting all marginalized groups. And that's inherently transformative. So this was the only quote I could think of for this bit. And I think it's important because there is nothing polite and nothing pretty about what transformation means. It will mean making trouble because it will completely upturn everything which is seen as like normal and right and easy and comfortable. But it's absolutely necessary. And also I think it's interesting that Macbeth was written at the time of the witch hunts and land enclosure as well. And powerful women are the most terrifying thing in that play. So this is how ecofeminism helps us respond to me, is it helps us name the roots. It helps us name capitalism, it helps us name patriarchy, it helps us name racism, white supremacy, colonialism. And that takes the climate crisis from this abstract, like how many parts per million of CO2 are in the atmosphere? That means nothing to me. Like, oh, how many species have been lost? I didn't even realize we could have that many species on the planet. To, oh wait, this violence of extracting fossil fuels from the earth is the same violence that's happening in my home. This is the same violence that's happened to my body. This is the same violence happening in the job market, in my workplace, in the rat race of our lives. And that, while it's scary, while many people don't want to politicize it in that way, they want to say, no, you know, climate crisis will affect us all at some point. So we need to frame it in a way that is comfortable for everybody, that like appeals to everybody's values. But this isn't, we call it the climate ecological crises, but it's not like the climate is in crises because there's something inherently wrong with it. Like something happened to it, you know, there's a reason for that. It's not like the biodiversity is just in crises. Something has been done to it. And it's important that, like, for me, it's a crisis of values and it's a crisis of power dynamics. So naming helps us bring that down to like a really solid level, and it helps us say, oh, it's not just humans, you know, it's nameable industries, it's nameable people, it's nameable systems. And for me, that helps us take direct action. So where women aren't in positions of power, where women aren't in leadership, how can these systems that we've named already, how can they help us fix that? So why would we want to be sitting at that table? Why would we want to be in the leadership positions that are so inherently destructive and that force us to enact in destructive ways? So for me, it really says ecofeminism teaches us that by valuing the social role that we already have, which might be community oriented, which might be around care, you know, whether we're good at these things or not, we might be placed in them. And if we can learn to value that, then we can start doing the work within our communities. We don't have to wait for somebody in a leadership position to say, oh, okay, or say, oh, maybe I'll consider this policy. We can start building those practices of care with our friends, with our families, with the people around us, and building the world that we want to build. We're already in worst case scenario pathways. So there are no fixes. There's only healing. There's only rebuilding from the scraps. And those are things that women and other marginalized people are placed to do, because we can see that constant going circle, that constant interconnection between the personal, the interpersonal, and the public levels. To bring that more solidly within our activist groups, it's also important that we bring these feminist approaches, because otherwise we'll replicate the violence present in gendered and nature oppression. So we'll be running on capitalist logic, on capitalist time, running ourselves into the ground, seeing who can work the hardest, who's the best at these like job market tasks, and not asking like, actually, what do we value? And in the end, women and marginalized people will be run out because they're already overburdened with caring responsibilities, with the pressures of being alive in a world that doesn't value you. So bringing an ecofeminist lens by helping us name, by helping us reclaim, and then by helping us take action, allows everybody to be there with the time that they have, with the resources they have, and to utterly like reimagine. Like, it just opens up our imagination to like new sources of action. I think especially when we allow patriarchy to take hold in our organizing spaces, you end up with people crying, you end up with conflict, it becomes a privilege to focus on the climate crisis when you're constantly fighting to be alive. And that is when you're constantly fighting to be included in those spaces. You know, it takes time away from focusing on it. Then everybody says, oh, you're distracting us. And it's like, we wouldn't have to be distracted if you recognize my humanity, you know? But of course, when we understand that patriarchy and climate destruction are linked, we can see even how unconsciously that logic travels through to stopping us taking action, because it finds us. So hopefully, I think, to end this, I think something that's important is to just, if you're ever like told you're being silly or something for taking on feminized tasks or prioritizing care within your activism, you should say no and understand like that's what will save us, and or not even save us, that just is what will make the climate crisis bearable as it continues to increase in the coming decades. And that's what will like keep us together. It's like all we have to do is just be there for each other, and that's a really beautiful thing that women are already socially positioned to bring to the table. Thank you.